The silence in Mr. Sterling's music room was a specific and precious thing. It was not an absence of sound, but a presence of quiet. It was made of old wood, aged paper, horsehair felt, and the faint, lingering scent of lemon oil and beeswax. It was a silence I had come to know intimately over the past 3 years, a silence I was paid to punctuate with the pure, ringing clarity of a perfectly tuned A above middle C. My work was to bring order to chaos, one string at a time, and in this house, that work felt less like a job and more like a calling. I had built my life around a similar principle of ordered quiet. My apartment was small, sparsely furnished, and meticulously clean. My routines were rigid, my interactions with the world kept to a necessary minimum. After the spectacular, noisy failure of my performance career at the conservatory, I had retreated into the precise, mathematical world of tuning. There were no audiences, no critics, no unpredictable variables beyond the humidity's effect on a soundboard. There was only the problem and the solution, the dissonance and the harmony. It was a safe, solitary existence. But every third Tuesday, that solitude was broken by this house. This Brownstone wasn't just a client address. It was another world. A world of quiet wealth, of art that wasn't for show but for love, and of Mr. Arthur Sterling himself. He was the silent center of this universe, a man who moved with a kind of gentle gravity that pulled everything into a graceful, unhurried orbit around him. He was perhaps 30 years my senior, with silver at his temples that looked less like age and more like a deliberate, artistic choice. My attraction to him was a quiet, hopeless thing I kept locked away like a rare instrument. It was a foolish, impractical secret. He was a patron of the arts, a known philanthropist, a man whose name appeared on the bronze plaques of museums and concert halls. I was the piano tuner. The class divide was not a gap, it was a canyon. So I focused on my work. I let my feelings dissolve into the overtones of a well-struck chord, a vibration that would fade into the perfect silence of his home. I kept a single memento of this silent fascination. A year ago, I had dropped my favorite tuning fork, a vintage Deegan I'd inherited from my mentor. The impact had thrown it just enough out of true to be useless to me. I'd mentioned it in passing, a simple statement of professional frustration. The next week, a small, heavy box was waiting for me on the piano bench. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a new fork, a Scheib-style fork of polished steel, perfectly weighted and humming with potential. There was no note. There didn't need to be. It lived in a special pocket in my tool roll, a secret talisman I never used on any piano but his. On this particular Tuesday, the usual routine was different. When I finished with the Grand Steinway, Mr. Sterling didn't just sign the invoice and see me to the door. He lingered by the piano, his hands resting on the polished fallboard, his gaze thoughtful. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air and illuminating the lines around his eyes. They were kind eyes, I'd always thought. Perceptive. "Leo," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to resonate with the wood of the room. "I have something I'd like to show you. A new acquisition." He led me from the main music room, down a short hall, and into a smaller, cozier study I'd never seen before. It was lined with books from floor to ceiling, and in the center of the room, draped in a soft linen cover, was the unmistakable shape of a keyboard instrument. But it was smaller, more delicate than the concert grand I had just been working on. He pulled back the cover with a careful, almost reverent motion. It was a forte piano, an ancestor of the modern piano. Its case was a warm, inlaid mahogany, its legs slender and square-tapered. It was beautiful, a piece of history breathing quietly in the room. "It's a Broadwood from 1816, he said, his fingers ghosting over the keys, which were reversed from the modern standard, ivory naturals and ebony sharps. The action is completely original, but it's sluggish. It needs more than a simple tuning. It needs regulation, careful restoration of the moving parts. It's a delicate, time-consuming process. I could only nod, my own fingers itching to feel the unique touch of those old keys. The mechanism of a Viennese action was a beautiful, intricate puzzle. It was the kind of work I dreamed about, the kind of project that rarely came along in a world of standardized uprights and digital keyboards. He turned to face me, his expression serious. The weight of his gaze was something I was used to, but this time it felt different. More direct. I've been asking around, speaking with curators. They all say the same thing, that this kind of work requires a specific touch, patience, a musician's ear and a watchmaker's hand. He paused. Your name came up more than once. My breath caught in my chest. It was one thing to be a competent technician. It was another to be recommended by the kind of people Arthur Sterling would consult. I would like to offer you a contract, Leo, he said, his tone clear and professional, yet with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite name. Hope, perhaps, to work on it here. It can't be moved in its current state. I would provide you with a dedicated space, access to my workshop, whatever you need. The project would likely take several weeks. I would, of course, compensate you at a rate that reflects the specialized nature of the work, well above your usual fee. My mind raced. Weeks. Here. In this house. In his proximity. It was both a terrifying and an exhilarating thought. The safe, ordered walls of my life felt suddenly thin. This was an opportunity, professionally, that I couldn't afford to dismiss. But personally, it felt like stepping off a cliff. He must have seen the conflict on my face. A small, understanding smile touched his lips. There's no pressure. Take some time to think about it. I've drafted a proposal with the scope of work and the proposed compensation. It's on my desk. He gestured toward a large mahogany desk in the corner. The choice is entirely yours. I want you to be comfortable. That phrase, I want you to be comfortable, settled something in me. It wasn't the voice of a wealthy patron making an offer he knew couldn't be refused. It was the voice of a man who was genuinely considering my agency, my comfort. It was an offer, not a command. It was ethical. It was kind. I walked over to the forte piano, and, with a questioning glance at him to which he nodded, I gently touched one of the keys. The action was stiff, the return slow, but even through the mechanical sluggishness, I could feel the soul of the instrument waiting. I could feel the music it had made, the history it held. I don't need time to think, I heard myself say, the words feeling solid and real in the quiet room. I would be honored, Mr. Sterling. Arthur, he corrected me gently. If we're to be working together for weeks, I think we can dispense with the formalities, Arthur. I repeated, and the name felt strange and wonderful on my tongue. The next Monday, I arrived not for a 2-hour tuning, but for the first day of a new, temporary life. Arthur greeted me at the door, dressed not in the tailored suits I usually saw him in, but in a soft gray cashmere sweater and dark trousers. He looked comfortable, relaxed, and impossibly handsome. He led me to a small, well-lit room adjacent to the study that he had cleared out for me. It had a sturdy workbench, excellent lighting, and a view of the quiet, walled garden behind the brownstone. I hope this will suffice, he said, his hands in his pockets. If you need anything at all, tools, materials, better coffee, you only need to ask. This is perfect, I said, my voice a little tight. It was more than perfect. It was a sanctuary. He helped me carry in my tool cases. As I lifted a heavy wooden chest filled with specialized regulating tools, he moved to take the other handle. His hand brushed against mine, a brief, warm contact. It was nothing, a simple accident of logistics, but a jolt went through me all the same. I pulled my hand back a little too quickly. He didn't comment, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Awareness, maybe. He simply adjusted his grip and we lifted the chest together, moving in a synchronized rhythm. His hands, I noticed, were not soft. They were clean and well kept, but there were calluses on his palms, the hands of a man who did things, who perhaps worked with wood or stone as a hobby. They were capable hands. The first few days settled into a quiet routine. I would arrive at 9, let myself in with the key he had given me, a gesture of trust that felt enormous, and set to work. I spent hours just studying the forte piano, carefully disassembling the action, one key at a time, labeling each delicate, handmade part. The work was slow, meditative. It required absolute focus, which was a blessing. It kept my mind from wandering too far. Arthur was a quiet, unobtrusive presence. He worked in his study, the door usually open. Sometimes the only sound for an hour at a time would be the soft click of my tools and the rustle of him turning a page. At precisely 10:30 each morning, he would appear at my doorway with 2 cups of tea on a small tray. He'd set one on my workbench, always on a coaster, and take the other back to his desk. He never stayed to chat, never interrupted my flow. It was a simple, consistent act of quiet care that began to feel like the anchor of my day. I started to watch him. not in a predatory way, but with the quiet observation of a portrait artist. I learned the way the light from his reading lamp caught the silver in his hair. I learned the subtle shift in his posture when he was deep in thought, the way he would lean forward, his chin resting on his steepled fingers. I saw the focused line of his brow as he reviewed documents, a line that would soften when he looked up and noticed me, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a small, almost imperceptible smile. One afternoon, I was struggling with a particularly stubborn pin in one of the key mechanisms. It was corroded and refused to budge without risking damage to the fragile wooden jack. I must have sighed in frustration, a small, sharp exhalation of breath. A moment later, Arthur was standing in the doorway. "Everything all right? Just a stuck pin," I said, trying to keep the annoyance out of my voice. "It's seized up. I don't want to force it." He came over and peered at the tiny mechanism I held in my hand. He smelled faintly of old paper and something clean and masculine, like sandalwood. He was standing close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I held my breath. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the piece. I handed it to him. He examined it for a long moment under the bright light of my task lamp, turning it over and over. "There's a penetrating oil in the main workshop downstairs," he said. "Very fine, for clockwork. It might work without staining the wood. Let me get it for you." He was back in a few minutes with a small bottle and a pinpoint applicator. He didn't just hand it to me. He took the piece again and, with a surgeon's steadiness, applied a minuscule drop of the oil precisely where the pin met the wood. His focus was absolute. I found myself watching his hands again, the confident and gentle way they moved. "Let it sit for an hour," he said, placing the piece carefully back on my workbench. It should free up, he was right. An hour later, the pin slid out with gentle, even pressure. I felt a surge of gratitude that was all out of proportion to the simple act of providing a bottle of oil. It was his attention, his quiet competence, his willingness to step in and help without making me feel incompetent. I began to analyze every small interaction, turning it over in my mind the way he had turned over that piano part. I replayed the way he'd said my name that morning. Was it warmer than yesterday? I wondered about the briefest of pauses before he answered a question. Was he choosing his words carefully? Why? The age and wealth gap was a constant hum in the back of my mind. He was from a different world, a world of effortless grace and security. I was constantly aware of my worn jeans, my carefully budgeted lunches, the fact that my presence in this house was transactional. He was paying for my time. That was the reality. To imagine anything else was to court delusion and heartbreak. And yet, there were moments that defied that simple logic. One afternoon, he came into my workshop and simply stood beside me, watching me work. I was refelting the hammers, a delicate task of cutting and gluing tiny strips of wool. We stood in comfortable silence for a full 5 minutes, shoulder to shoulder, both of us focused on the tiny, intricate work in my hands. The air between us was thick with unspoken things. I could feel the soft material of his sweater brush against my arm. I didn't pull away. When I finished the hammer I was working on, I placed it carefully in the drying rack. I finally looked up at him. His expression was soft, unguarded. "Your focus is remarkable," he said, his voice low. "It's a quiet job," I replied, my own voice barely a whisper. "Quiet work is often the most important," he said. And then he did something that sent my carefully constructed defenses tumbling. He reached out and gently placed his hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a pat or a squeeze. It was just a placement. A steady, warm weight that seemed to seep through my shirt and into my very bones. The touch lingered for a beat, 2 beats, then he gave a gentle squeeze and removed it. "Let me know when you're ready to start reassembling the action," he said, his voice perfectly normal, as if he hadn't just sent a lightning bolt through my entire nervous system. "I'd like to see it." He left the room, and I stood there for a long time, the phantom weight of his hand still burning on my shoulder. It was an ambiguous touch, a gesture that could have meant anything. Encouragement, camaraderie, simple approval. But my heart was pounding, and it knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that it meant more. The days bled into weeks. The fortepiano's action was slowly, painstakingly coming back to life under my hands. Each part, cleaned, repaired, and regulated, was a small victory. My relationship with Arthur evolved in a similarly slow, painstaking way. The morning tea ritual continued. The quiet companionship became a given. The small, ambiguous touches became slightly less ambiguous. A hand brushing mine as we both reached for the same schematic. A brush of shoulders in the narrow hallway that neither of us apologized for nor hurried away from. He would find reasons to be in my workspace, asking intelligent questions about the restoration, his interest genuine. He learned the names of the parts, the escapement lever, the jack, the damper, and spoke of them with a familiar ease that thrilled me. He was not just a client. He was a participant in the instrument's rebirth. One Saturday, I came in to do some extra work. I hadn't planned on him being there, but I found him in the main music room, wrestling with a large, heavy bookcase. He was trying to move it from one wall to another, and it was clearly a two-man job. "Let me help," I said, setting my bag down. He looked up, a little breathless, a faint sheen of perspiration on his brow. "Leo, I didn't expect you today." "You don't have to." "I want to," I said. "You'll hurt your back." A small, grateful smile touched his lips. "All right. Thank you." For the next hour, we worked together. We emptied the shelves, stacking books in careful piles on the floor. We coordinated our movements, lifting and sliding the heavy wooden frame across the room. "On three," he'd say, his voice low and steady. "1, 2, 3. Lift," and we would lift, our muscles straining in unison. It was physical, practical work. There was no employer and employee, no billionaire and piano tuner. There were just two men, moving a heavy object. We were equals, partners in a simple, shared task. When the bookcase was finally in its new position, we stood back, both of us breathing a little heavily. The air in the room was charged, not just from the physical exertion, but from the easy intimacy of the shared labor. "I couldn't have done that without you," he said, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. "Happy to help," I said, my heart thudding in my chest. He went to the small wet bar in the corner of the room and poured 2 glasses of sparkling water with lime. He handed one to me, our fingers brushing. This time, I didn't pull away. I let the contact linger, a silent acknowledgement of the shifting ground beneath our feet. We sat on the sofa, the empty bookcase looming across the room. For a long time, we just sipped our water in a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who have no need to fill the space with noise. Then he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Leo," he began, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "I hope my offering you this project, this extended time here, I hope it hasn't felt in any way coercive. That wasn't my intention." The question hung in the air between us, raw and vulnerable. It was an admission of his awareness, of the power he held, and of his deep-seated desire not to misuse it. It cracked his stoic facade wide open, showing me the decent, thoughtful man beneath. "No," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I cleared my throat. "No, Arthur. Never. It's been the best professional experience of my life. I'm glad," he said. But his eyes were still searching mine, looking for something more. "But I'm not just talking about the work. I'm talking about my presence, our interactions. It's important to me that you feel entirely at ease here, that you feel you have a choice in all things." It was an open door, a direct, terrifying, beautiful invitation to be honest. My heart hammered against my ribs. Here it was, the moment to retreat back into my safe, ordered silence, or the moment to step through into a world of terrifying uncertainty. I take a breath. It feels like the first one I've taken in years. "I am at ease here," I say, and the truth of it surprises even me. More than anywhere else, a visible wave of relief washed over his features. The tension in his shoulders seemed to melt away. He gave me a small, genuine smile, not just with his lips, but with his whole being. It was like watching the sun come out from behind a cloud. "Good," he said softly. "That's very good to hear." The moment passed, but it left an indelible mark. He had seen the power imbalance between us not as an advantage, but as a responsibility. He had named it, and in doing so, had given me the power to name it, too. He had shown me his vulnerability, and in return, he had earned my trust. The quiet foundation that had been settling between us for weeks finally felt like solid ground. The tipping point came on a Thursday. The forte piano was almost fully reassembled. I was in the final stages of regulation, adjusting the minute escapement settings, a process that required intense concentration and the ability to hear the subtlest differences in touch and tone. Arthur had a visitor, a man named Julian who was introduced to me as a fellow collector and a board member at the symphony. Julian was everything I expected a friend of Arthur's to be, impeccably dressed, oozing a kind of casual, confident arrogance. He glanced at me and the disassembled instrument with a look of mild, dismissive curiosity. "Still tinkering with the old music box, Arthur?" Julian asked, his voice carrying across the room. "Leo is performing a museum-quality restoration," Arthur corrected him, his tone perfectly level but with an edge of steel I'd never heard before. Julian chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. He walked over to my workbench, peering at the intricate mechanism of the action. "Quite the project for your tuner," he said, loading the last word with a subtle condescension that made my skin crawl. He looked at me as if I were a piece of furniture. "You must be paying him a pretty penny to keep him cooped up in here for so long," before I could formulate a response, or more likely, just shrink into myself. Arthur was there. He moved to stand slightly in front of me, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of protection. "Leo is a master of his craft," Arthur said, his voice quiet but utterly commanding. The room seemed to shrink, all the air sucked toward him. "His time and expertise are invaluable. He is not cooped up, he is an artist at work, and he is my guest." The words "my guest" landed with deliberate, shocking force. It was a reframing of our entire relationship, a public declaration that shifted my status from paid contractor to something else entirely. Something respected. Something personal. Julian was taken aback. He raised his hands in a placating gesture. Of course, Arthur." No offense intended to the young man. He gave me a cursory nod and quickly changed the subject, turning his attention to a painting on the far wall. I stood frozen, my hands hovering over the keyboard. My face was burning. Arthur had defended me. He had stood up for my dignity in a way no one ever had before. The protective gesture was so clear, so unambiguous, it made my heart ache. It was an act that made his feelings obvious without claiming any ownership over me. After Julian left, a thick, charged silence descended on the house. I tried to focus on my work, but my hands were trembling slightly. The tiny regulating screws seemed to mock me. I couldn't find the calm I needed. Later that evening, as I was packing up my tools, Arthur appeared in the doorway of the workshop. He leaned against the frame, his arms crossed, his expression somber. "Leo," he said, "I want to apologize for Julian's behavior today. It was inexcusable. You don't have to apologize for him," I said, my voice tight. "It's not your fault. He was a guest in my home," Arthur countered gently. "His disrespect toward you is my responsibility. It's important to me that you feel respected here." In every way, he pushed off from the doorframe and took a few steps into the room, closing the distance between us. The air crackled. His eyes held mine, and the subtext of his words was a deafening roar. He was talking about more than Julian, more than the restoration project. He was talking about us. I meant what I said, he continued, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur. "You are my guest here. Your presence in this house has become important to me." Far beyond the work on the piano, my breath hitched. My carefully constructed walls were crumbling, turning to dust. I had to say something. The silence was no longer a refuge. It was a coward's retreat. "It's important to me, too," I whispered, the words feeling fragile and immense at the same time. He took another step closer. We were only a foot apart now. I could see the flecks of gray and blue in his eyes. I could see the deep sincerity etched in the lines of his face. He gave me an out, one last chance to retreat to safety. "Leo, if my saying this makes you uncomfortable, you only need to tell me. We can go back to how things were. I will respect any boundary you need to set." He was explicitly naming consent, putting all the power in my hands. It was the most respectful, most seductive thing anyone had ever done. And in that moment, I knew I didn't want boundaries. Not with him. I wanted the opposite. I wanted to tear them all down. I find my voice. It is shaky but clear. "Your presence doesn't make me uncomfortable." Arthur, my gaze is locked on his. The world has narrowed to this small space between us. It's the opposite. A flicker of raw emotion crossed his face. Relief, hope, a breathtaking vulnerability. But he waited, letting me finish, giving me the space to be fully heard. "I think about you when I'm not here," I confessed, the words tumbling out now, quiet but unstoppable. "I listen for your footsteps in the hall. The tea you bring me every morning. It's the best part of my day. He closed his eyes for a brief second, as if absorbing the weight of my words. When he opened them again, they were shining with an intensity that took my breath away. Leo. He breathed my name like a prayer. He reached out, not to touch me, but just to hover his hand in the space between us, a silent question. I have wanted this. I have wanted you here. In my home, in my life. But I couldn't. I wouldn't, unless I was certain it was your choice. Freely given my choice. He had given it to me at every turn. And I was making it now. I leaned forward, closing that final inch of space, and rested my forehead against his. The world tilted and then settled, finding a new, perfect center. I could feel his breath on my skin, warm and steady. I could feel the solid presence of him, a man who was not a billionaire or a patron, but just Arthur. My Arthur. He brought his hands up to cup my face, his thumbs stroking my cheekbones with an infinite tenderness. His skin was warm, his touch sure. He searched my eyes one last time, a final, silent question. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. And then he kissed me. It was not a kiss of frantic passion or pin-up demand. It was a kiss of arrival. It was slow and deep and breathtakingly gentle. It was a conversation, a question and an answer, a confirmation of everything that had passed between us in weeks of silent observation and quiet care. His lips were soft, the pressure firm but unhurried. It was a kiss that tasted of relief, of recognition, of coming home. It was right. Utterly, completely right. When we finally broke apart, we didn't move away. We stayed with our foreheads pressed together, breathing the same air. He laced his fingers with mine, his grip firm and reassuring. I could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart through the palm of his hand, a counterpoint to the wild drumming of my own. Leo, he murmured again, his voice thick with emotion. Arthur, I whispered back. There was nothing else to say. We had finally found the harmony. He didn't press for more that night. He seemed to understand, with that innate perception of his, that the confession and the kiss were the destination we had been traveling toward. Anything more would have been too much, too soon. He walked me to the door, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back. At the threshold, he turned me to face him, his expression serious but soft in the warm glow of the porch light. Get some rest, he said. We'll talk in the morning. He didn't kiss me again. He just squeezed my hand, a gesture of profound, grounding reassurance. And then I was walking down the stone steps and into the cool night air, my world irrevocably and wonderfully changed. I barely slept. My mind was a kaleidoscope of the day's events. Julian's condescension, Arthur's fierce protection, the loaded silence, the terrifying vulnerability of my confession, and finally, the soul-settling rightness of his kiss. I lay in my small, quiet apartment, and for the first time, its ordered solitude felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. I wanted to be back in the Brownstone, in the warm, complicated, real world of Arthur Sterling. When I arrived the next morning, a knot of anxiety had formed in my stomach. Was it real? Had I imagined the depth of it? In the harsh light of day, the canyon between our lives seemed to yawn wider than ever. He was Arthur Sterling, and I was just Leo. What could I possibly offer a man who had everything? I let myself in with my key, my hand trembling slightly. I found him in the kitchen, a bright, airy room I'd never been in before. He was standing at a large marble island, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He was wearing another soft sweater, this one a deep forest green that brought out the blue in his eyes. He looked up as I entered, and his face broke into a smile that chased away all my fears. It was open and warm and full of undisguised happiness. Good morning, he said, his voice imbued with a new, easy intimacy. I was hoping you'd be early. Coffee, please, I said, my voice a little hoarse. He pushed a mug across the island toward me. It was a simple, ceramic mug, heavy and warm in my hands. We stood in silence for a moment, just sipping our coffee, our eyes meeting over the rims of our cups. He seemed to sense my lingering unease, the questions swirling in my head. He put his mug down and leaned against the counter, his expression turning serious again, but not somber. It was thoughtful. Leo, he began, his tone measured and kind. I want to be very clear about something. What happened between us last night was significant for me, and I want to continue this. I want to see where it goes, he paused, letting the words sink in. But I am also acutely aware of the context. I am your employer. This is my home. I want to navigate this in a way that honors your independence and your integrity." He was doing it again. He was naming the elephant in the room, addressing the power imbalance head-on with honesty and respect. Every word he spoke was another brick in the foundation of my trust in him. "The piano," he continued, "is a separate matter. Our professional agreement stands exactly as it was. Your work is your own. This," he gestured to the space between us, "this new, personal connection does not change the terms of that agreement. Your pay, your hours, your creative control over the restoration, that is all sacrosanct. Is that clear?" "Yes," I said, a wave of profound relief washing over me. "Thank you for saying that. It needed to be said," he stated simply. He reached into his pocket and placed a single, antique-looking brass key on the counter, separate from the one I already had for the workshop entrance. "This is a key to the front door. It's not a symbol of ownership or expectation. It's a symbol of trust. Come and go as you need." "For the work," he said, his eyes twinkling. And for me, the gesture was perfect. It offered intimacy without obligation, access without demand. It was another choice he was giving me. I picked up the key. It was heavy and cool in my palm. "Thank you," I said again, my voice quiet. A small test of this new dynamic came a few days later. The restoration required a specific set of custom-made tuning pins to match the originals, and the cost was significant, nearly a month's rent for me. My first instinct, born of pride and a lifetime of self-sufficiency, was to absorb the cost myself, to eat ramen for a month to maintain my sense of independence. I mentioned the need for the parts to him, carefully phrasing it as something I would be ordering. "Good," he said, nodding. "Send me the quote from the fabricator. I'll approve it, and you can submit the invoice with your next 1 inch. "Oh, no, I can't," I started to protest, the reflexive words of refusal already on my lips. He held up a hand, stopping me gently. "Leo, it's a project expense. The materials are part of the restoration budget we agreed upon. This isn't me giving you money. This is us keeping our arrangement professional and clear. It's important, and I understood." He was protecting me, not just from the financial burden, but from the feeling of being beholden to him. He was diligently maintaining the boundary between Arthur the employer and Arthur the something more. It allowed me to breathe, to accept his help without feeling like I was sacrificing a piece of myself. It was an act of profound care. With the awkwardness of our new beginning navigated and the boundaries clearly, kindly defined, something began to bloom between us. We started to spend our evenings together. After I'd cleaned up my workshop for the day, I would find him in the library, and he would pour us each a small glass of whiskey. We would talk for hours. I told him about the conservatory, about the crippling stage fright that had ended my performance dreams, a story I had never told anyone. He listened without judgment, his gaze full of a deep, compassionate understanding. He told me about his late wife, who had passed away over a decade ago, speaking of her with a gentle fondness that was beautiful to witness. He talked about the pressures of managing his family's foundation, the weight of a legacy he had never asked for but felt a profound duty to uphold. We were two solitary men from different worlds, discovering that our loneliness was made of the same material. The canyon between us began to fill in, not with money or status, but with shared stories, with vulnerability, with laughter. He had a dry, witty sense of humor that took me by surprise, and the sound of his deep, rumbling laugh became my new favorite note. The forte piano, the catalyst for it all, was nearing completion. The day I finally installed the last key of the fully regulated action was a momentous one. Arthur stood beside me as I placed it into its slot, the tiny, perfect mechanism sliding home. "It's done," I said, a sense of pride and a little bit of sadness welling up in me. The project that had brought me into his life was ending. "Let's hear it," he said, his voice soft with anticipation. I sat down on the bench. My hands hovered over the keys for a moment. This wasn't just a test of a restored instrument. It felt like a performance, the first one I had given in years. But this time, there was no fear. There was only Arthur, my audience of one. I began to play a simple Bach minuet. The sound that emerged was unlike anything a modern piano could produce. It was delicate, crisp, with a singing, almost vocal quality. The notes were silver threads weaving a tapestry in the quiet room. The action under my fingers was responsive, swift, and alive. It felt like shaking hands with a ghost from the past. I played through the piece, my heart swelling with every phrase. When the final note faded into the room's perfect silence, I let my hands rest on the keys. Arthur didn't applaud. He simply reached out and placed his hand on my shoulder, that same warm, steadying weight I now knew so well. "You didn't just repair it, Leo," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave it back its voice." We stood there for a long time, his hand on my shoulder, the resurrected voice of the old piano hanging in the air between us. The project was over, but I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that our story was just beginning. A few days after the forte piano was finished, we sat on the sofa in the music room, the evening light casting long shadows across the floor. The professional part of our relationship had concluded. I had submitted my final invoice. He had paid it promptly. The transactional nature of our meeting was officially over, leaving us in a new, undefined space. Arthur swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his expression thoughtful. "This is new territory for me," he said, finally breaking the comfortable silence. "Dating, I suppose it's called. I feel rather out of practice," I smiled. "Me too. I want to do this right," he continued, turning to look at me directly. "I want to build something real with you, Leo. Something steady and honest. And I think, to do that, we need to step outside of this house. Away from the context of where we met." My heart gave a hopeful leap. "What did you have in mind?" "Next weekend," he said, a hopeful light in his eyes. "There's a small inn on the coast, a few hours north of here. It's quiet, private. We could go, just for a couple of days. No pianos, no work. Just us. A proper first date, perhaps." It was a perfect idea. A neutral space where we could just be Leo and Arthur, without the ghosts of our professional history lingering in the corners. It was a conscious choice, a deliberate step onto a new path together. "I would love that," I said, and the smile he gave me was dazzling. The final scene of my old life played out on my last official day at the Brownstone. I had packed up all my tools, leaving the workshop even cleaner than I had found it. I was doing a final check of the instruments, a courtesy I extended to all my long-term clients. Arthur came and found me in the main music room, where I was polishing the fallboard of the big Steinway. He didn't speak. He just came and stood beside me, leaning against the curve of the piano. He watched my hands as I worked the soft cloth over the gleaming ebony finish. It was a quiet, domestic moment that felt more intimate than any grand romantic gesture could have. There was no tension, no uncertainty. It felt like an arrival. I finished my work and turned to him. "Everything is in order," I said, my professional voice sounding strange and formal in this new context. "I have no doubt," he said softly. He reached out and took the polishing cloth from my hand, setting it aside. Then he took my hand in his fingers lacing through mine. He brought my hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to my knuckles. "The piano tuner's hands," he murmured against my skin. "They've brought so much beauty back into this house." He looked up at me, his eyes full of a deep, abiding affection that made my heart feel too big for my chest. "Thank you, Leo, for everything." I look around the room, at the art, the books, the beautiful instruments. For weeks, this house had been a symbol of the vast distance between our lives. It was a place where I worked, a gilded cage of wealth and status that I could visit but never belong to. But now, standing here, with my hand in his, the room felt different. It was no longer just his house. It was the place where he had protected me, where he had listened to me, where he had first kissed me. It was the place I had started to feel safe enough to be myself. It was starting to feel like home. My old life was a fortress of solitude, built to protect me from the noise and judgment of the world. It was a quiet, ordered, lonely place. Arthur hadn't stormed the gates or torn down the walls. He had simply stood outside, patiently, and offered me a key to a door I didn't even know I was looking for. He used his resources not to control or possess, but to create a space of safety and choice where I could find my own way out. The difference in our ages, in our bank accounts, those things hadn't vanished. They were facts, part of the landscape of our lives. But they were no longer a canyon separating us. They were just context, the geography of the place where we had happened to meet. The foundation we were building was made of stronger stuff. Mutual respect, shared vulnerability, and a quiet, steady care. He was still holding my hand. He gave it a gentle squeeze, pulling me from my thoughts. "Ready to go?" he asked. We weren't heading to the coast until the following week, but I knew what he was asking. Ready to leave the roles of employer and employee behind? Ready to step into the unknown together? I squeezed his hand back, a firm, confident pressure. I felt steady. I felt hopeful. For the first time in a very long time, I felt unafraid. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and true as a perfectly struck note. "I'm ready." Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.